Well, we all know what it's like to have a bad day. We all know what that's like. Sometimes even have a bad week, to have a bad month, to have a bad year. You ever had things just go terribly wrong, gone very different than what you had hoped for? A guy by the name of Larry Walters did. Now, you may say, who is Larry Walters? Well, Larry Walters was a truck driver from Southern California, and his dream, his life goal, he always wanted to be a pilot. But Larry had very poor eyesight, so the Air Force rejected him, and he could not get his pilot's license, but he didn't give up on his dream. When Larry was 33, he achieved his dream of flying by fastening 45 helium-filled weather balloons to an aluminum chair and taking off from his backyard. And Larry's goal was to float about 30 feet above his yard and drink a few beers and have some beef jerky and then shoot out the balloons with a pellet gun that he had and float gently back down to earth. Mission accomplished. Well, Larry, with his beers and his beef jerky strapped to his lawn chair, carrying a CB radio, took off. But instead of flying up a near 30 feet, Larry shot up immediately to nearly 16,000 feet, just about 3 miles high. And he was so high and it was so unstable that he feared to shoot any of the weather balloons out with his little gun. And so he just, instead of floating over his backyard, he drifted for miles and miles away from his home and across the main approach pattern for the Long Beach airport, where he interrupted air traffic and pilots called in to say, hey, there's a guy in a lawn chair with weather balloons floating up above. Do you know anything about that? So Larry, after about an hour, after hearing from all kinds of authorities on his CB radio, decided to take the chance and shoot the weather balloons with his pellet gun, and he began to float back down to earth. However, he landed on some power lines as he was landing, and he caused a blackout for the entire city of Long Beach. And he was able to crawl down one of the poles where he was immediately arrested and fined $4,000. To top it off, Larry, right afterward, gave his lawn chair to a boy who admired his exploits and saw the whole thing happen. And within a few days, the Smithsonian Institution called Larry, because he was national news, asking to put his lawn chair in the Smithsonian. Larry Walters had a bad day. Now we're looking at the life of Jesus this morning, and we can ask, well, did Jesus ever have a bad day? And if he did, how did he handle it? One of the ways we can know God's character and that God reveals to us who he is through the bad days that we have. When we go through a trial or we experience a difficult time or we have a Larry Walters kind of day, week, month, or year. And I want to pick up talking about Jesus' bad couple of days with a return to his hometown of Nazareth. Now, at this point in Jesus' life, some months and maybe even years into Jesus' ministry, he was famous. He was an absolute rock star. Jesus' name was whispered everywhere, from the village market into the halls of power, and he healed the sick, and his teaching was sharp, and he called disciples and sent them back out, and miracles were as thick as fleas around him, and thousands upon thousands of people followed Jesus wherever he went. Then he came to Nazareth, his hometown. One of the things I love about Kansas is when you drive through Kansas and you pass through some small town, well off the interstate, a tiny little hamlet, right at the city limits, they almost always have a sign posted that says, hometown of Mr. X or Mrs. Smith. There's someone who is usually of importance. They did something of note somewhere, sometime, that everyone soon forgot about except people in their hometown. Except for my hometown in Missouri, which is the hometown of Jesse James. People still talk about what he did. So let it suffice to say that Nazareth, outside of Nazareth, there was no sign. For Jesus, there was no sign at all. In fact, when Jesus, the famous wonder worker and teacher, the son of Mary, the presumed son of Joseph, arrived in Nazareth, he taught in the synagogue. He wasn't treated like a returning hero. They didn't roll out the red carpet for him. He was treated as a goat. He taught there, and people began questioning everything that he was saying and doubting his authority and challenging his place. The Nazarenes were very offended by what Jesus had to say, but Jesus proclaimed, a prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and in his own household. Now, some of you may remember in another gospel, Jesus' family said about Jesus, he is out of his mind. So he wasn't even honored in his own household. If anyone ever says about your family, they say that I'm out of my mind, know that you're in really good company with Jesus on that. So Jesus, he kicked the dust off the sandals of his feet, left his hometown without performing a single miracle. The only time we see this happen in the Gospels. Now, being rejected by the people who raised you, who knew you from when you were a tiny child, questioned you, called out by the people that you believed loved you, that would have been a bad day. That would have been a bad day. But it didn't end there. Not long after Jesus was rejected by his hometown of Nazareth, we are told he learned of a terrible event, a horrible event. His cousin John the Baptist, his closest friend who had known him from the womb, the man who knew him best, Jesus was told he'd been cruelly executed. His cousin had been killed by the cruel, tin-horn dictator of Galilee, a man by the name of Herod Antipas. This is the very same Herod before whom Jesus would stand in a matter of months as a convicted criminal. And when some Pharisees threatened Jesus one day saying, you know that Herod Antipas, he wants to kill you, Jesus. Jesus said to them, you go tell that fox that I'm going to finish the job that I've been given to do. Now, since we're going to come across Herod Antipas again, we need to ask, who was this guy? Who was this guy? And why was John the Baptist's death at his hands such a terrible thing and so indicative of the sin that Jesus came to conquer? Well, Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great. That is a Herod we know from the Christmas story, the same Herod that tried to trick the wise men into giving them the location of the little baby Jesus. And when they did not, when they instead tricked him, he had every baby in and around Bethlehem, every baby boy under the age of 2, killed. And his son, Herod Antipas, did not fall far from the tree. His son was a Roman appointee, and his number one job there in Galilee was to keep the peace, to keep the people living under the thumb of Rome. And he lived in incredible luxury while all the people that he was there to serve supposedly scraped out a living from the desert. Herod Antipas had been part of an arranged marriage to an Arab princess, and after he'd been married to her for about 30 years, he fell in love with his niece, a woman named Herodias. Yeah, these people had about 2 names. They just kept passing around from family member to family member. And Herodias demanded that if her uncle really loved her, he would divorce his wife of 30 years and marry her, which he did. And he threw his ex-wife, the Arab princess, in prison. And in that prison eventually was another celebrity prisoner, John the Baptist. See, John had spoken out against Herod's adultery with his niece, and he was arrested for it. And Herodias hated John for this. And she was not just satisfied with John just being in prison. Herodias wanted John dead, and she waited for an opportunity to make it happen. Matthew 14, 6-8 tells us about that opportunity. When Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath that to give her whatever she might ask. And prompted by her mother, she said, give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter. So Herodias' daughter danced for her uncle and her stepfather, Herod, as a birthday gift. And she likely performed the well-known and well-liked by men dance of the 7 veils. And Herod was so impressed with this dance, with her performance, that he impulsively promised to give her anything she wanted as a gratuity. And her mother told her to ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And John was beheaded in prison, and his head was delivered to Herodias on a platter. And Jesus was told this. Can you imagine how this twisted, capricious injustice would have just revolted Jesus? How that would have just stirred in the deepest wells of his soul? And at the same time, he must also have seen a grim picture of what was to come for him. And indeed, even as he was rejected by his hometown of Nazareth, Jesus must have seen how this world, the entire world, would soon come to reject him altogether. Yeah, Jesus was having a bad day. Indeed, he was having a couple of bad days. What did he do? How did Jesus react? Well, Jesus did 3 things. He did 3 things. Jesus served, and he sought, and he celebrated. He served, and he sought, and he celebrated. Now, serving was not his immediate reaction. There are some stories in the Gospels where we're just brought face to face with the reality that the Son of God is a real human being, with real emotions and real struggles and genuine pain. And Matthew teaches us that Jesus got into a boat and he went out to a desolate, out-of-the-way place to be alone for a while. But the crowd that was following him found him floating out in the sea, and they walked along the seashore begging and pleading with Jesus to come on shore and minister to them. What would you have done there? What would you have done there? What would anyone do who's having a bad day, who'd been devastated by some terrible news? I can tell you what I would have done. I would have started paddling to get to the other side. I'll see you all later. You'd say, this is a bad time for me. I need to get away. I just want to get alone. When we are hurt, when we are wounded, when we have pain, our instinct is to cover up and protect ourselves, get as far away as we can. That's our instinct. Jesus didn't do that. He didn't do that. Matthew teaches us that Jesus, he had compassion on that crowd, and he did what people who have compassion do. He served. And Matthew teaches us that Jesus healed all day. A great crowd of 5,000 men, Matthew says, plus women and children. And when evening came and it was dinner time and there was nothing to eat except 5 loaves and 2 fishes, Jesus took these meager offerings and he took them in his hands and he looked down and he gave thanks to heaven and he broke them, and the whole crowd, thousands and thousands, were fed with plenty left over, 12 baskets full. When we're having a bad day, helping someone else who is also having a bad day, well, that can change things. That can change things. I've seen this happen in my life many, 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 many times. One of my first experiences, and one that just sticks with me, is one of the first ever international mission trips that I ever took was to Nicaragua. And in Nicaragua, we worked among the poorest of the poor. And my life at this time, it was an absolute mess. It was a mess. I had problems in every area of life. I had vocational problems. I was working for a church, but I didn't really want to be working for a church. I had living arrangement problems. I house sat for a family that summer, and I had no place to live and no money to pay for it after I moved out in just a few weeks. I had relationship problems. I had income problems. There was a lot going on. I was having more than a rough day. I was having a rough year. And the cherry on the cake of it all, the thing that seemed to be emblematic of everything going on in my life that wasn't right, was I had purchased a car stereo. Remember, I was having income problems, and I purchased a car stereo. And it did not work. It didn't work. I had it installed, they didn't install it right, and I took it back to the dealer several times, and they pled ignorance. Well, we don't know why it doesn't work. When I got back in my car following that mission trip, I turned on my stereo, and it still didn't work. Just instinctively, I turned it on. And I could feel the frustration level just rising in me again. But it was just like a big hand suddenly, calmly and gently pushed it back down again. You see, I had spent 10 days with people whose least of their worries was a non-operational car stereo. You should ask any of the 40 people or so who threw the Valentine's Day party at Grace United Ministries this Thursday if their day got better or worse. Jesus did not allow a bad day to stop him from serving. And serving is a good start, but serving is not enough. Jesus also sought. He sought. He sought out his heavenly Father. Matthew 14, verses 22 through 23. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, and while he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. To pray. Now, this tells us everything we need to know about prayer. If Jesus, who is perfect, needed to pray, how can we who are imperfect get by without it? I mean, I don't know about you, but if I'd heard terrible news about the person who I love the most in the world, quite likely the person who knew me the best on earth, had been killed, and I had taught all day, basically preached, let's say, a 12-hour sermon, performed miracles, and then made a meal for, say, 5,000 or so out of nothing, my first instinct would be to lie on the couch, watch some TV, maybe take a nap when it was all done. And Jesus could have done at least one of those 3 things. He didn't. He didn't. He needed to pray. And immediately after Jesus fed the masses, he dismissed the disciples. And this time he put them in the boat and sent them to the other side of the sea. And he went up on the mountain all by himself to pray and cry out to the Father. Well, what did he pray for? Wouldn't we like to know how that prayer went that night? As he prayed early in the morning on the mountaintop. For what did the Son ask his Father? Did he ask for strength? Did he cry out for justice? Did he doubt? Did he ask like he did in the Garden of Gethsemane? Father, is there any other way to bring righteousness to this world than through my poured out blood? He likely did. We do know that within a few days or even a few weeks, Jesus would begin telling his disciples that he himself would go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and he would be killed. He also taught them that on the third day he would rise again. You see, when we're having a bad day, when we are confronted with adversity, when we face a situation that falls short, we can look to one of three places. We can look down. We can look to our own resources, our own ability, our own strengths, our own gifts. We can pull up our bootstraps and by our own talent and strength seem to conquer it. But what happens, as it inevitably does, that we discover that our strength and resources are not enough. Secondly, we can look around. We can look for someone to blame. Well, whose fault is this? Who made this happen? Who caused this terrific trial in my life? Who's responsible here? Blaming someone else is always easier than taking the blame ourselves, and although it may make us feel a little better for a little while, blame does not change the world. And all it does is it bruises our heart. Third, and by far the best, is we can look up to the Father. We can seek Him right where we are. The best, most powerful prayer is immediate. It's immediate. By immediate, I mean it must have a real-world application. It must be real-world to us. Real-world prayers are answered in the real world. Simple prayers and simple prayers simply look around and we see what does not fit with Jesus' kingdom. And then we tell God about it unashamedly and unreservedly in plain words. Prayer asks God to rule where I am. We ask Him to rule in the things that are most immediate to us, things that we can reach out and touch, our schools and our neighborhood and our work and our family and our church. We ask God today to give joy to Julie, who's going through a hard time and shares my cubicle. We ask God to help my boss make an ethical decision about the project we're working on. We ask God to protect my son from the cruel words of a boy in his class. We ask God to glorify Himself in my life as I run around doing 17 errands this afternoon that I need to do. It's immediate. It's right there. The 4th century Celts, who planted a flag for Jesus' kingdom in a wild and pagan and bloodthirsty land, people who were surrounded by people threatening them at every turn, had a prayer they called St. Patrick's breastplate, his breastplate. And it went like this: I rise today with the power of God to pilot me, God's strength to sustain me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's eye to look ahead for me, God's ear to hear me, God's word to speak for me, God's hand to protect me, God's shield to defend me, God's host to deliver me from a snare of devils, from evil temptations and from nature's failings, from all who wish to harm me far or near, alone or in a crowd. I rise today in power's strength, for to the Lord belongs salvation, and to Christ belongs salvation. When we're having a bad day, when we're surrounded by folks who want to do us harm, we need to seek out God through prayer. Immediate, real world, tangible prayer. Third and finally, Jesus celebrated. He celebrated. If you go to Larry Walters' grave, which is in Hollywood Hills, California. You'll see a plaque with his name on it, and dates of his birth and death, and this description: lawn chair pilot. Lawn chair pilot. What was Larry Walters' very bad day actually became his defining moment, his very bad day, a cause for celebration. When Christians celebrate, what do we celebrate? What do we celebrate? Do we celebrate our circumstances? Sometimes. That's fun. Do we celebrate our victories? Yeah, perhaps, when we can. Do we celebrate our blessings? Absolutely, when they're apparent. But if we really want to celebrate, if we want to celebrate even during bad days, we will celebrate something that is constant and it is consistent. We will celebrate God's character. We will celebrate who He is. And the Bible is filled with examples of celebration of God's character, celebration of who He is. Psalm 97:1 is just one of them. The Lord reigns. Let the earth rejoice. Let the many coastlands be glad. Cloud and thick darkness are all around, and righteousness and justice are the foundation of His throne. And because God is who He is, we can celebrate even if we are having a very bad day. The disciples sat alone in a boat that had been pushed far from shore by a driving west wind. And sometime, we don't know exactly when, between 3 and 6 in the morning, they saw this shadowy figure walking on the water, and they had no idea who or what this could be, and they cried out in terror, "It's a ghost." Well, it was Jesus. And as far as I can tell, this is the only miracle in Scripture that Jesus did when He was by Himself. Maybe He did it for Himself. And I think He was celebrating His divinity. The Lord who made sea and sky was enjoying His mastery over the elements. And when the disciples called out, immediately Jesus spoke back to them. He said, "It is I, don't be afraid," is how most versions translate what He said. But the Greek phrase here is the very well-known ego eimi, which literally translated is the phrase, "I am. I am. I am. Don't be afraid." Does this sound familiar to anybody? I am was the name that Israel used to refer to God. When Moses was standing before the burning bush and he asked God to tell him His name, God responded out of the fire and the smoke, "Say this to the people of Israel. Tell them, I am has sent me to you." And every time you hear or you see in the Old Testament the phrase, "the Lord," it is a representation of the Hebrew word for I am. You see, God's name was considered so holy that to even write it down or speak it was considered blasphemy. And Jesus not only said this name, not only said God's name, He claimed it for His own. And as he walked atop the wind and the waves that night on the Sea of Galilee, this is who Jesus said He was. I am. I am. Jesus celebrated. He celebrated. In those two little words, 3 letters, He told us everything about Himself and about God that we need to know. He celebrated God's character. He celebrated God's promise. He celebrated His identity. He celebrated the role the Father had given Him to play in the cosmos, because I believe He was at peace with it. And because Jesus celebrated those things, and because God's character is constant, so can we. So can we. Even if we're having a bad day, a bad week, a bad year, we can celebrate. Even if our circumstances are far from celebratory, we can celebrate. Even bad days can't define us, because we know Jesus is greater. We know that He is the great I am, even if I feel like I am the giant I am not. Because those bad days are going to come. But when we seek and when we serve and when we celebrate, God not only gets us through that day, He conquers it for us. And God not only conquers that day for us, He readies us and He steadies us for the next one to come. Jesus' bad days weren't over because immediately after Jesus walked on water, Matthew tells us He began His journey, His march toward the cross. In this broken world, the bad days won't stop. They just won't stop. But if we serve and we seek and we celebrate, we will not stop experiencing Jesus' power and His presence in our life.